Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1.
The thinking atheist. It's not a person. It's a symbol. An idea.
The population of atheists in this country is going through the roof.
Rejecting faith. Pursuing knowledge. Challenging the sacred.
If I tell the truth, it's because I tell the truth. Not because I put my hand on a book and made a wish.
And working together for a more rational world.
Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way.
Assume nothing. Question everything. And start thinking. This is the Thinking Atheist Podcast. Hosted by Seth Andrews.
There is simply no way to take a shallow dive into Zionism, the nation of Israel, the beginnings of the nation of Israel. I mean, its history is so vast, it is so complicated, it is so crazy that a single podcast simply is not going to do it justice. And I'm not an expert on the Israeli people. I'm just a guy who probably, like you, has been playing catch-up, trying to get a bearing on what the hell has been going on in the Middle East and what were the precursors for that. Now, I got a couple of interesting interviews on the way. I'm going to be speaking with Casey Malone. She is an ex-evangelical. She used to be a Christian Zionist, a biblical Zionist, and she came out. She's an activist. I actually have a longer form conversation with her on the horizon in December. That's a whole different story about deconstruction, but she had a lot to say about Zionism, and she does a lot of activism speaking about it. Then I've got a guy, Brant Burleson. He used to work for the Israeli government to do public relations, for lack of a better word. He calls it a psyop in the United States to try to sell Americans on a blind support of the nation of Israel. And he had a whole bunch of different tactics that were being used to do that. We are going to hear from him. That's going to be in the last segment of the broadcast. But right here, right now, because I have to give it a shot, here is a basic primer, as best as I can understand it, for the nation of Israel. By the way, if you're wondering about why it's called Zion, it is actually of Old English, Greek, and Hebrew origin. It is derived from the ancient Canaanite hill fortress in Jerusalem called the City of David. So it's referred to as Sion, S-I-O-N. There's a T-Z-I-O-N, T-S-I-Y-O-N. There are roughly 70 names for Jerusalem, and the Hebrew Zion is one of them. Okay. We start way back in about 1000 BCE. This is when the first temple is built in Jerusalem under the reign of David and Solomon, according to the Christian Bible. So that's roughly a millennium before the alleged life and death of Jesus Christ. The Jewish temple built in Jerusalem, but 300 years after that, the Assyrian Empire comes in and they force a resettlement. The Jews are essentially expelled and stripped of all their power. That's 722 BCE. Just over 100 years after that, King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, goes into Judah. He destroys the capital of Jerusalem and expels even more Jews from their homeland. The temple is destroyed. Now, this is the holiest site in Jerusalem. It is destroyed totally during that siege. 50 years after that, there's a Persian conquest of Babylon. Remember, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon went in and he totally just wiped out Jerusalem. Well, the Persians defeat Babylon in 538 BCE, and then they return the Jews to Jerusalem under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah. And again, I have to say, I'm leaning into the biblical narrative for the nation of Israel. The second temple is constructed in 515 BCE, but the temple itself remains kind of a flashpoint for all kinds of conflict. And this is where the holiday of Hanukkah comes from. Just about 200 years before the appearance of Jesus Christ, the Syrian king Antiochus Epiphanes went in and he desecrated and Hellenized the temple of Jerusalem, which means that Epiphanes went in and he imposed Greek language and customs and culture in this Jewish area. And under the sword, he made a whole lot of Jewish practices and traditions illegal. But even though the Jews were outnumbered at that time, they teamed up with the Maccabees and they fought back. They routed the Syrians decisively. They re-sanctified the temple and they re-established all of these Jewish practices and traditions that had been outlawed. And that pushback, that revolt, rebellion, victory over the Syrian king provides the foundation for today's holiday of Hanukkah. 70 CE. This is barely into the new millennium. This is supposedly the time of Christ. The Romans conquered Judea. They went in and destroyed the Second Temple. They exiled many of the Jews, but a whole lot of Jews continue to live under Roman occupation in the land of Israel. Rabbinic Judaism is formed around that time, and it flourishes for about 300 years. 638 CE, about 700 years into the new millennium, there is a Muslim conquest of Jerusalem and the establishment of Muslim rule in the region. And this begins the tug of war between the Jews and the Muslims. But the Muslims treated Jews like second-class citizens. They called them dhimmi. Now, the word dhimmi in Arabic means protection. But this was not a protection of the Jewish people. This was subjugation. 1100 CE, the First Crusade and the capture of Jerusalem by Christian forces, and they come in and they persecute and expel the Jews from the city. 1517 saw the Ottoman conquest of Jerusalem. Many of the chosen people living in that region under the imperial rule of the Ottomans. It was in 1791 that France granted citizenship to Jews. And many historians say that this precedent, France granting citizenship to Jews, provided the first few threads in the larger fabric of Zionism, the establishment of a Jewish state. 1882 saw the first modern wave of Jewish repatriation, the Hebrew language revived and modernized by Jews living in the region. A more formal push to restore Jews to an autonomous rule in the homeland of Israel began in 1897. The first Zionist Congress was established in Basel, Switzerland. 1917, the Balfour Declaration, which supported the establishment of a, quote, national home for the Jewish people. This was a declaration that was offered up by the British government. There is a cultural renaissance for the Jewish people in the 1920s and 1930s. The Hebrew University of Jerusalem was established in 1925. And during this entire time, we continued to see that tug of war, the resentment, often even hatred between Arab states and the Jewish people. The UN in 1947 recommended to partition two separate states, the Jewish state and the Arab states. The city of Jerusalem would remain under international administration. The Jewish leaders said, okay, we like the idea of this partition. The Arab states and Palestinians rejected it. 1948 saw the official establishment of the State of Israel, a declaration of Israel's independence, and the subsequent Arab-Israeli war. It was a war of independence for the Jews. Many in Palestine described it as the Nakba, which translates to catastrophe in Arabic. There's so much resentment over this establishment of Israel on what many Palestinians believed was their territory that Arab nations expelled 850,000 Jews from their homes in Arab countries. And the vast majority of those Jews who had been kicked out, they emigrated to the nation of Israel, where their descendants live even today. They are known as the Mizrahi Jews. 1964, 16 years after the establishment of the nation of Israel. During an Arab League summit in Cairo, Egypt, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was formed. This is an organization representing Palestine's aspiration to go in, destroy Israel, and establish a Palestinian state. June of 1967 saw the Six-Day War. Israel gained control of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. This is a battle fought against the Arab nations of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. September of 1967, 3 months after the Six-Day War, the Arab League Summit in Sudan ends with the signing of something called the Khartoum Resolution. The Arabs will not recognize Israel, they will not negotiate with Israel, and there will be no peace with Israel. 1973, Egypt and Syria launch a surprise attack on Israel during Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish year. 1979, the history-making Camp David Accords. This is where Israel and Egypt signed a peace treaty. This led to Israel withdrawing from the Sinai Peninsula. There was a period of tentative peace between two former enemies. Then comes the First Lebanon War in 1982, a Palestinian uprising against the Israeli forces of the West Bank and Gaza, 1987, another series of tentative treaties in 1993 and 1994. More violence and unrest in 2003. The violence of that conflict said to set the stage for the rise of Hamas in Gaza. Israel pulls out of the Gaza Strip in 2005. It dismantles its settlements and all of its military installations. There's another Lebanon war in 2006. In that same period, Hamas takes control of the Gaza Strip. And of course, the conflict between Israel and Hamas continues and even amplifies today. And then October 7th, 2023, thousands of Hamas terrorists infiltrated Israel and brutally staged an attack during a large music festival in southern Israel. More than 1,200 people killed, an additional 250 kidnapped. Hostages remain in Hamas captivity even now. And against that extremely simplified primer, we see Zionism, the support of a Jewish homeland for a number of reasons. And I'm going to ask both of my special guests about their take on the definition of Zionism. It is a messy, messy situation. You know what I found interesting in my cursory research on the subject was that there are many Jews who are opposed to an establishment of an Israeli state. They oppose nationalism. Many people say that the state of Israel will be established upon the arrival of the Messiah. So when the Messiah shows up, that's when Israel becomes formally established. To do it now would be putting the cart before the horse. Of course, there's a whole lot of anti-Semitism involved by many who oppose an Israeli state because they just oppose the Jews. And there's one last angle I find interesting before I get to my interviews here. A shield that many people are using to excuse anything and everything that the state of Israel, the nation of Israel does. If you hold up a hand and you say, well, I disagree. Maybe I disagree with the establishment of an Israeli nation, given its history. Maybe I want to criticize Netanyahu and the genocide in Gaza. One of the defenses is you are an anti-Semite, a bigot, and you are in opposition to the will of the Almighty. Well, that ties in perfectly to the conversation I'm about to have with a former Christian Zionist. Her name is Casey Malone, and I'm going to chat with her next. Okay, next up, I want to talk to Casey Malone. She is an ex-evangelical, and she runs the Casey Malone YouTube page. Okay, so you are a local, I'll call you an activist, that'd be a word. What do you do?
Yeah, activism, I suppose.
Coming out of a fundy faith.
And
you were God is establishing Israel as Zion in advance of his return. Is that right?
Yes, I was raised as a fundamentalist, which means literal interpretation of the Bible. And in my upbringing in the megachurch I went to, that meant we took the book of Revelation seriously. And there is a lot of Armageddon conversation, which of course results in essentially a stance on global policy based on our religion growing up.
From your perspective, define Zionism.
So I spend a little bit more time and energy talking specifically about Christian Zionism, but Zionism on its own is the establishment of the land of Palestine/Israel, specifically for people of Jewish descent. For Christian Zionism, the way in which I was raised, this is based on the interpretation of the Bible.
Zion being established, God's chosen people, a sovereign nation, which is immune from, I look at Netanyahu and I think he can say and do whatever he wants because #Zion. Is that what you're seeing?
There's a lot of nuance here, but there are a lot of different kinds of motivations for Zionism. There are secular/political motivations outside of Christianity itself. But yes, for Christian Zionism, really the point of Christian Zionism is actually not in solidarity with Jewish people at all. Really, it is to establish the land of Israel, to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, which was very relevant when Trump moved, I believe, the embassy to Jerusalem in 2018. Evangelical Christians saw that as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. If I was still in that environment, I'm sure I would have heard all about it like that, at the time in 2018. But the Christian church views all of that happening in the Middle East, again, not in solidarity with any group of people, but in the resulting fulfillment of biblical end time prophecy, because all of those things need to happen in order for Jesus to return. That's their actual motivation.
So this is apocalypse thinking. This is like bring the end, the destruction of this material world, and we all go to heaven stuff?
Yes. So the term is eschatological, which is kind of a term about studying the end times. And really baked into Christian theology itself is this idea of looking toward and hoping for and being excited about what's next after this life. And that's why a lot of people refer to Christianity as a death cult, because you're not going to get essentially any goodness or fulfillment until you die and go to heaven. And what that looks like on a grander scale is, Jesus is going to return and then everything's going to be okay. So there's this anxiety about a lot of real world problems. Suffering exists on this planet. Everyone, including Christians, have it hard under certain systems that don't put people over profit, right? But what that can be manipulated into is this belief system that is very, not just believing and hoping for the end times, but resulting in the voting habits of actively bringing it about. In my evangelical upbringing, there was like an aspect of celebration whenever there was conflict in the Middle East, right? Because it was always, not just in Sunday school, but in Bible class every day where I was going to school, celebrated as this is God's plan finally coming about.
Crush the evil Arab because they are in violation of God's good word, that kind of thing?
Yes, kind of. I often talk about how the word Zionism was only in the forefront of the media I consumed or the conversations I was having twice in my life. The first time was when I was an actual child in middle school, high school, being told to be a Zionist without question, being told that being a Zionist is biblical, that's what God wants. And then the second time is more recently, when as an adult and after deconstructing, I've kind of done my own self-education on what Zionism actually means. We're seeing it in the media more, etc. But in that first time period, whenever I was being told to be a Zionist, I actually talk about how the Palestinians and Arabs were not even mentioned. Not only were they not mentioned as, the false accusation of them being the aggressors, I should say, but they just weren't even mentioned. There were no Palestinians. This was just the land of Israel gifted to the Jewish people. That was it.
I have to ask this question. We're just chatting. I'm not going to hold you anything. We're not scholars. We're not PhDs on the subject. We can't read minds. Okay, I've done the asterisk on this question. You think Netanyahu was not glad about October 7th, but it kind of ostensibly gave him permission to just pull the trigger and do whatever he wanted, to commit genocide in Gaza. Do you think there's a culture of people who are like, okay, fine, now we have our excuse, it's on?
I think it's very clear there are trails, there's even trails of money connecting Netanyahu with evangelical networks in the United States. And so in large part, he's got consent of evangelicals to do pretty much whatever he wants because he's fulfilling their theological end times prophecy of establishing the land of Israel specifically for the Jewish people. As far as October 7th goes, A part of me almost like wishes I was still in the evangelical circles to know how it was being framed, because I don't know. But I imagine, to your point, that it was essentially a go-ahead on behalf of Netanyahu's part with the backing, I imagine, of this entire evangelical voting and monetary base.
Bumper stickers, billboards, church marquees. We support Israel. I support Israel, which is a blanket statement. Essentially, it's reductive thinking. Whatever they do, however they do it, I support Israel. It's almost like America is the greatest country, my country, right or wrong. It's very binary. Did your faith, I know you came out of evangelicalism, did your faith promote binary thinking?
Pretty much exclusively. I mean, down to the core of believers versus non-believers, down to the core of essentially even our thoughts were either influenced by God or the devil, right? It's all just good or evil, black and white, yes or no.
And what do Americans get wrong? This is such a big question, but you can give me a few examples. What are we getting wrong about the situation in the Middle East?
I think the efforts of stabilizing an area of the world after we destabilized it, or had at least a very significant role in destabilizing it, is backwards and essentially ridiculous. And I think a lot of people like to think that our military can go in and just bring peace or democracy to these peoples who frankly deserve to establish their own sense of peace and democracy, but I don't know, maybe can't do that when we keep going in via our own military or through the funding of Israel's military to bring about conflict. Sometimes intentionally for the sake of conflict, sometimes for power grabs, sometimes for the resources. But again, it goes back to, I very consistently say that the religion of Christianity in the United States is the mechanism through which all of this consent is manufactured, because it is framed as in the name of God.
It's like a Rush Limbaugh-ism. Let's go and Americanize the rest of the world because we've got the secret sauce.
Exactly.
We know what greatness looks like. We're doing them a favor by coming over and planting flags and teaching everybody else how to be American.
Yeah, that's worked well so many times. We should just keep trying to do it over and over. It'll be great.
What do you think of Donald Trump? We know he does. He's not a Christian. We know that. The only God he worships is himself. He's not a Zionist in the biblical sense. What do you think motivates him to do what he does to tie in with Netanyahu? I mean, is he pandering to the American Project 2025 evangelicals because they provide him power? I mean, we know he thinks mega pastors and evangelists and those people are idiots. I see it all as a power grab and it's all optics, but I don't know. I want another perspective.
No, I think you're right on the money. I think him coming into the power that he holds right now is probably the most indicative example of how the Christian base in the United States, specifically the evangelicals, can be motivated to vote certain ways, and how it actually doesn't matter what that person in power actually believes. Because it's interesting, because we'll see like more progressive Christians kind of say, well, he's not a true Christian, right? That's a great no true Scotsman. I'm sure that's super convenient for your worldview. Okay. But, you know, they'll say this about him. And then, but we have the question to ask in response is, okay, well, why is he able to use the Christian base? You say he's not a real Christian. Why is he able to claim Christianity and use the evangelical Christian base to vote in his favor? Why did he get into power in a predominantly Christian nation is really the question that we have to ask ourselves.
I was hardcore, but I know in my bones I would have never fallen for Trump. When
you think so?
I remember going after even the televangelists, you know, like I grew up.
Oh, really?
I grew up in the Oral Roberts culture. Yeah. My parents loved him. I thought that guy's full of crap. And I remember there were some other people. I really feel like I was a Christian nationalist. I held this, but I would have seen Trump and thought, oh, come on. Do you think you would have fallen for?
I think I drank enough Kool-Aid. I was in the home of mega church pastors. I think I drank enough Kool-Aid. I probably would have.
You would have bought into the.
I might have.
He is the brilliant businessman, savior, God's proxy, who is rescuing America from them evil, woke, lib, infidel types.
Yeah, pretty much. Well, I think a lot of it is also just like the privilege that comes with being a white woman in America. I didn't really look closely at any of these details.
Yeah.
You know, like at any of the fine print. It's just like, oh, the church said vote this way. Okay.
Well,
I'm going to go to church,
who knows where I would have gone? I mean,
Fair, same.
You and I might have been at the same Kool-Aid trough at the time.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm just giving myself too much credit. Okay, so when it comes to end times theology in relation to Israel, how dangerous are things right now? I mean, we are watching the militarization of end times philosophy and theology. People want the end of the freaking world.
They do, and that radicalization is only increasing. There are plenty of studies that show the correlation between political instability and increased religious extremism, and that is evident by the rise in evangelical power in the United States right now, which kind of makes no sense, but that's the fact. So what happens is, as this intensity and anxiety about the end of the world, and all of these very real anxieties, whether or not they want to believe in climate change, but at the very least, scarcity of resources, things like that, those are real issues with a population of 8 billion people, but it's getting transmuted into this end times prophecy of, so we have to make sure Israel is established, right? What I would say to that is that I still think it's important to recognize that we, compared to 3 years ago, compared to October 7th, the main zeitgeist is a lot more aware of the actual plight of the Palestinians, and we are coming into more awareness of these systems that are not serving people and valuing profit. And we are becoming more connected with others, and there are more causes for hope. It's certainly important I mean, it's kind of going in tandem, right? This hopeful kind of resistance mindset is rising, but then so is the radicalization.
Including many of the Israeli people who cannot stand Benjamin Netanyahu and are protesting, right?
Well said, yeah.
Yeah. I remember we used to believe climate change, whatever, resources, deforestation, pollution, whatever. It's all a resource. God gave dominion to Adam. He's going to show up anyway. Jesus will return and sweep up. So, I mean, who cares if we ruin the planet? I mean, we didn't phrase it that way, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. I was raised with that exact mentality. What I've seen recently is a lot of Christian content creators are instead saying, well, actually, it's not about dominion. God gave us stewardship over the land, right? And they're trying to make it a little bit nicer, a nicer theology instead of dominion. Those are the two kind of offshoots of Christians' relations to the climate. But stewardship still puts humans outside of the environment. And it still is a hierarchy of it's humans over the environment, right? Stewards are taking care of the environment because God told us to, and not this recognition that we are of the environment, and not this kind of more fluid ecosystem of relationships between us and all of nature that I think is still missing from this concept of stewardship.
We could go on a variety of subjects, but do you talk about Zionism in more depth on your channel?
I sure do. Yeah, I have a 3-part series, actually.
How do people find you?
You can find me on YouTube. It's at Casey Malone, KAYSEMELONE, or the Casey Malone Show podcast.
I will link to your channel in the description box. Thank you so much for talking to me.
Thank you.
My next guest wrote these words on the 9th of September 2025 in an article titled, "I Helped Israel Propagandize American Christians." At the very beginning, he says, Sun Tzu wrote, "All warfare is based on deception." You've heard many stories about the Israeli government deceiving and manipulating U.S. officials, steering our country towards funding and even fighting their wars. Let me tell you one more. Israel exploits the religious beliefs of American Christians, fostering a certain flavor of fanaticism to empower a doomsday cult in a twisted effort to serve the interests of this increasingly genocidal apartheid state. I know this because I was a central useful idiot in this psyop. The name of the gentleman who wrote this is Brant Burleson, and I'm going to speak to him next. A hot button issue here in the United States and all around the world is, of course, Israel. It's a thick subject, and a lot of people wink out. It's too much, or, they've already sort of settled on a binary opinion. It's all nothing. And yet the world so often does not look like that. And so I wanted to have a conversation with someone who has sort of seen behind the curtain and has a perspective that may help all of us to form or maybe evolve our opinions. Huge thanks out to Brant Burleson for joining me. Brant, good to see you.
Great to see you, Seth.
Tell me about your background. What is it that you've done that sort of gives you some equity in this conversation?
Starting in 2016, I was hired as the Strategic Outreach Director for the Consulate General of Israel to the Southwest United States here in Houston, Texas. So we covered 6 states: Texas, New Mexico, Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. And my title, like I said, was Strategic Outreach Director, but really what it was I was the Christian Zionism and Interfaith Director for the consulate. And the consulate is, in a country like as big as the United States, is essentially like a miniature embassy. So the Israeli taxpayer paid my salary. I had a .gov.il email address, but I'm an American. So I would describe this essentially as I kind of became a propagandist and was exploiting people's religious beliefs as part of a religious-based psyop to get them to adopt an uncritical support for the Israeli government based on theology and to push their elected officials to adopt such a view as well.
Okay, well, there's a lot to unpack, so let's go back. Define Zionism from your perspective.
That word means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, ranging from everything to you think Israel has the right to exist to being essentially a fanatic for Israel or thinking that Israel has the right to, brutalize other individuals. And when I say Israel, I mean the government in this case. One of the thought processes or framing of that word that I think is the best to use is that Zionism is kind of a scaffolding for a building that's already been built. Essentially, like at the end of World War II, you had a lot of kind of nationalist, anti-colonial movements and countries that were trying to seek new independence, and one of which was Israel. And so that is kind of what the Zionist movement was. So once Israel gains its independence in 1948, I'm kind of the opinion that that word isn't necessarily the most useful anymore. But a lot of times in contemporary discourse, Zionism is getting used just to say someone who is a pro-Israel person.
When I hear Zionism, though, I tend to think in terms of biblical Zionism.
So in particular with Christian Zionism, that is definitely the case. So, going back to 1948, a lot of Christians that were kind of a more fundamentalist sort of mindset saw the reestablishment of Israel as a kind of signifier that we're one step closer to the end times because we know in Revelation that Israel exists. And then, they see when Israel takes control of Jerusalem in the 67 war, oh, now we're one step closer again because we know that they control Jerusalem. And that's where the Messiah comes back in Revelation. And then so now I fear the next shoe to drop is that there'll be some sort of an event where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is destroyed and the third temple is rebuilt. And then in that case, it becomes imminent in these people's eyes. And I think that's particularly startling because, essentially these kind of biblical prophecies become self-fulfilling because people are trying to make them happen as opposed to just watching them passively play out.
Am I hearing many want the end of the world?
Yeah, it is not at all a stretch to say that these people are literally rooting for Armageddon on the side of Christian Zionism. And then there's many on the actors in the Israeli government who aren't religious themselves, they're pretty secularists, but are willing to take advantage and exploit this theological belief system because they see it as a strategic advancement for Israel's interests. And then there's other people, actors in the Israeli government, who are themselves fanatical, coming from like more Orthodox Judaism. And they will work with these folks because they see it as, well, we want the Messiah to come the first time. So it's really, and sometimes this is explicitly said in some of the organizations that I was working with and networking with.
It's like Christian nationalism. Catherine Stewart has written about the power worshippers. There are true zealots, and there are people who understand the usefulness of weaponizing the religion for power, influence, money, etc. So you were, for lack of a better word, a regional PR person for Israel in the United States.
100%. Yeah.
You said the word psyop. I can't let that go. What do you mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's a psychological operation. So I feel, we could pull up the exact definition of it, but it's pretty fitting term. I'm utilizing belief system that people have and exploiting that in order to get them to change their behavior and orient it in a way that is beneficial to a foreign government or that they see as beneficial. I would contend that it's actually not in Israel's long-term interest. I think it's actually pretty startling. I think it's playing with fire in a lot of ways. But, with that being said, that's very much what I was doing. And I was the first person to hold this up. So I built this all out from scratch. I had built an enormous database of all these Christian media organizations, individuals, megachurch pastors, all of it, even Catholic Church. It went far beyond the evangelical church. And, you're right to mention Christian nationalism in that because a lot of this was very much tied up with that. And especially now, especially in this last year or so, you've seen a real divide in the Christian nationalist movement between Christian nationalists who deify Israel and Christian nationalists who demonize Israel. And I mean that quite literally. So you have, this theological based support and you have this theological based anti-Semitism, and they're very much visibly coming to a head right now. And you see that in the divide between the Tucker Carlsons of the world and some of the like Douglas Wilsons or John Hagees of the world.
All right, take me there. You call someone who is a Christian, or you reach out in some way, you invoke God's chosen people. You quote from the Bible. You are influencing them. What kind of language do you use? All right, let's do a situational.
So that would vary wildly depending on which kind of Christian I'm talking to, or sometimes it was even other faith groups, because eventually I reached out way beyond just Christian churches as well.
Now, hang on, hold on. Does that include Muslims? Because I know
yes.
that Israel and Islam.
Yeah,
I'm saying, yeah.
So there was very much this mixed bag where eventually, especially in the third consul general I worked under, we started doing more and more outreach to liberal Christian organizations, Muslim groups, other minority faiths, Hindus, everything. And a lot of that was kind of a damage control, sort of turd polishing, I would call it, move. That was often completely separated from the more traditional fundamentalist Christian Zionism thing that we were pushing. So there was kind of these two faces and two hats I would wear, where I would put on a completely different mask, talking to one person and then talking to another. But to answer your original question, so when I'm meeting with more of a fundamentalist type, usually those people are already excited to meet with me. I would let them do most of the talking. I would try to get them to come up with the idea to do an event together on their own instead of me suggesting it. I would utilize that, so usually these people were explicit in saying, I view it as a biblical commandment from God to support the Jewish people because they're his chosen people, and they interpret that as the contemporary Israeli government. This goes all the way up to people like Mike Huckabee, who is a former pastor and our current ambassador to Israel. And he is explicit, and this is his approach to how he views this. What little of it is grounded in actual U.S. strategic policy initiatives is getting distorted through a theological lens. So I would use verses like Genesis 12:3. I got a ton of mileage out of that. I would mention that to everyone. That's the verse that says, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. You even saw Ted Cruz, when he did that recent interview with Tucker Carlson, referenced that verse and saying, this is why we need to support this government. And it's always unquestionably, there's not really any thing with it, even when it clashes really clearly with a lot of other policy priorities for a lot of these people when they're talking about, well, we want to cut the foreign aid budget to zero. We don't think we should be doing it except for the $4 billion plus a year that we give to Israel. That obviously needs to keep going because we need to stay on the right side of God. And that's sort of their approach. So I would use verses like that. And then to contrast that, when I would reach out to more liberal or even affirming churches, I would not focus on scripture so much. And I would talk about how, well, Israel's the only place in the Middle East where it's safe to be gay. These are the churches that have, rainbow flags and everything. And then, but when I talk to the conservative churches, I just don't mention that at all, which is really, really gross. So I started this job as a liberal Christian, pretending to be a conservative Christian a lot of the time. And then by 2020, just seeing all this so often play out, I mean, this just broke me in my faith, and that it just completely destroyed it. And I still was doing so. Then I was an atheist, pretending to be a liberal Christian, pretending to be a conservative Christian, lying about my own views 40 hours a week, writing scripture and speeches that were given by diplomats, doing prayer campaigns, pretending to pray. Sometimes I delivered speeches at churches, and I'm saying stuff that I don't believe on behalf of a cause that I don't really agree with for a paycheck. And it was actually pretty sinister and evil and gross to kind of exploit this sense in people that they were looking for a place to belong, a sense of community, a sense of meaning in their lives. And that's being used and exploited to advance a political project of a foreign government.
Do you support Israel? Its right to exist?
Yeah, I mean, if that's the basic question, do I think Israel should exist or has the right to exist or shouldn't be like annihilated from the earth? Of course. I know many Israelis who are fantastic people. I've met them, I worked with them, and then I know some who aren't. It's no different than the United States in that regard. Like, there's 8 million people in Israel. No matter what your opinion, their political situation or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you're likely to find millions of Israelis who vehemently agree and disagree with whatever your position is. It is an incredibly fractious society. You saw that before October 7th with the judicial reforms and the massive protests that were taking place against them. And that kind of took a back seat when the conflict started. But yes.
My challenge comes in when, I come from a culture, I come from a family that had pro-Israel stickers on. And what this was a thought stopper. So whatever Israel was doing, whatever Netanyahu might do, that's okay. I mean, he's God's proxy. They are part of the biblical narrative. Therefore, if they want to go and commit genocide in Gaza, well, sometimes you got to break a few eggs to make the omelet. Is there a rift in Israel over Netanyahu?
Yeah, there's been a lot of protests, like I said, before the war and after the war. So for people who might not have been paying as close attention to Israel politics before the war, the Netanyahu government was actually launching a series of judicial reforms that were essentially meant to end judicial review in Israel. So a simple majority in the Knesset, Israel's parliament, could have just completely ignored any decision that the courts made in Israel about the constitutionality of any law, which essentially makes the judiciary pointless. So there was massive protest against this. It's a serious backsliding of democracy and checks and balances in that country. And I don't say that from any sense of superiority here. We have plenty of that going on here, and it's also alarming. I say that in a sense of solidarity with Israelis who care about or are deeply concerned with the direction of their government. Needless to say, once the conflict started, all of that took a backseat, and I haven't heard hardly anyone talk about those proposed reforms since then. And then since the war started, you had many Israelis protesting it, and many who were supportive of it, even to a fanatical and genocidal level. I can give you some examples of rhetoric I've heard on that, but you also had you had families of Israeli hostages, people who were taken hostage by Hamas, who were deeply critical of the Netanyahu government's prosecution of the war and thinking that, well, these airstrikes that you're doing are likely to get our family members killed. And I think that was a completely valid concern for these people to have.
Let me take a short break. I'll be right back. We're going to continue this conversation about what Brandt called a PSYOP involving Israel and the United States. We'll get more next. Talking here with Brandt Burleson, who used to be I'll call it a PR guy for the nation of Israel. Did you work for both Israel and the United States?
I would just one little surreal thing to think about. I would pay my taxes. My government would send a portion of that money to the Israeli government, and then the Israeli government would pay my salary, and then I would pay my taxes, and it would just go round and round and round. So I was
So
very
you're
much in this whirlwind of political violence and theology. I'm not the good guy in this story. I'm coming here to tell y'all, coming to the conclusion that gods aren't running the world means that there really has to be some human accountability and moral agency here. And I want to give people a warning to, hey, if you live in this country, your country's foreign policy vis-a-vis this region of the world is being filtered through a theological lens.
it's terrifying.
Yeah.
Like
And
mythology
if
is
you don't live in
informing.
this country, then the biggest superpower in the world's foreign policy is being filtered through this, which should be equally terrifying for you. So it's not just an American issue.
All right, well, you don't have to answer, but I'll bet you do. Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, I use the word genocide. Would you use the word genocide? Is he guilty of genocide?
I would use that word. And I think if you look at the legal definition of the intent to destroy in whole or in part a people group, yeah, it fits that definition. And I have to
So
live
this is
knowing.
Christmas for him, if I may. This is like he got the excuse he thought he needed.
Yeah. And I think it especially changed one thing for me. Like, I started this conflict and I've seen a lot of the raw footage from October 7th attack. It was somewhat radicalizing for me. I definitely went to a headspace that I look back now with a lot of regret. And I wanted there to be this Israel that was ethical, that was trying to fight this just war. I do think there was a just reason to go to war. However, I think that Israel's behavior and conduct in that has veered wildly into a place that was cartoonishly and nakedly evil. Starting in March, I think it was, when they were saying no more aid gets in, that was a complete change of the game for me because, like, someone can make an argument if they want to about the legal nature of, okay, a militant organization has hijacked civilian infrastructure for militaristic purposes, then yeah, technically the legal burden for that getting targeted is on the group that did that. However, I don't not seeing many people who are conducting this who seem very torn up at all about that targeting. A. B. I could grant them everything they're saying about morality and collateral damage and war, which is an inherently dehumanizing phrase, but just put that aside, you'd still be left standing there having to defend deliberate starvation campaign. And that is unquestionably a war crime. Like, not letting formula in for babies. Like, this has gotten insane.
I'm using the word cartoonishly evil in a sentence later on. I'm going to borrow that from you, Brant, just because I live in a country right now that's surrounded by things that are cartoonishly evil. And I agree. No one's saying that Israel shouldn't have responded strongly after the kidnapping and the rape and the murder and the horrors of October the 7th. I'm not trying to say that no response was justifying. The only reason I say that is not because I think you understand, but because there are people who will drive by in the comments section and be like, oh, Seth thinks they should have rolled over, or he doesn't think that, Israel has a legitimate right to defend itself. And nuance is hard in a binary thinking world. How did you finally stop lying on stage and in person about Israel? You said you were going through it. You were a wreck. You knew you were telling things that weren't true. You obviously stopped and busted out. What's that look like?
I mean, that was a years-long process. Even before becoming an atheist, I always thought it was weird. This was not like the kind of Christianity that I was brought up in. I was raised in a pretty, moderate to progressive Christian circles in the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. So this was a new world for me. So I had been looking for jobs within 1 month after I started working there. When I took the job, I didn't know much at all about Christian Zionism. I thought I was mostly going to be like promoting tourism to holy sites. And I thought, oh, that seems pretty innocuous. And this was my first like real job in this field that I'd been wanting to break into for a long time. And I look back at that now and just like, I was very foolish to think this. So over time,
Now, hang on, Brant. Hang on. I'm sorry. Was it a bait and switch? Did they groom you and say, oh, you're going to come in and do surface stuff, and all of a sudden they've got you doing hardline PR?
No, I don't. That's not the right term for it. And I don't want to. It wasn't so much a bait and switch as it just wasn't really said. So I remember when I applied for the job, for example, I actually first applied to be an executive's assistant, and I didn't even know which consulate I was applying for until I showed up there. And then I didn't get that job, but during that interview, the consul general at the time asked me just randomly, "Oh, what did your parents do when you were growing up?" I think he was just making conversation, and I mentioned, "Well, my dad was a pastor." So he then proceeded to go, "Oh, so you probably know a little more about the Christian world and the different denominations than most people." And I said, "Yeah, probably more than most." And he said, "Well, we might have this other position opening up that would be more of an interfaith position. Would you be interested in doing that if we did?" And at the time, like I said, I have massive student loan debt. I went to get a master's degree in international affairs that I hadn't been using. And so I said yes, kind of without thinking, and then got that call later and did it. And I think, if I had to guess, I think the consul general at the time thought, okay, here's a guy with background in IR. And I don't think he was into this pushing the Christian Zionist thing. I don't think he was comfortable with it, but I think the ministry probably told him, you have to fill this position. And I think he goes, okay, so here's someone that knows that world. Here's someone that speaks Christianese, and he's not insane. He is not rooting for Armageddon, clearly. So he's probably the least bad choice I can go with. No one ever said, we want you to run a PSYOP, but it was like, we want you to harness all this energy in the Christian Zionist movement, get it organized. We want you having us going to events. We want you meeting with people. We want you networking. And then all the feedback I ever got when I was writing remarks for speeches, communications, it was never tone it down on the religious stuff. It was always add more scripture, add more of this. Like, that's what we want. So it wasn't explicitly like, no one goes, we want you to go lie and deceive people. But it was also, that was kind of what we knew we were doing.
So one day, did you just say, screw this and quit? Is that what happened?
No. So I became an atheist eventually in 2020, just after constantly being exposed to these questions and working in this environment where I was just like, well, you can't all be right. And I'm seeing how easy it is to manipulate people with religion because I'm doing it. Like, I didn't look behind the curtain. I was the wizard behind the curtain. So I started just writing this journal as a kind of cathartic experience about everything I was dealing with and thinking about. And over time, that became like essentially a book. Like, I have a 400-page book draft now. And I just kept collecting like little clippets of, oh, here's what happened. Here's what this person said. Here's this video. Here's this email. Here's all my database. And I had just been like sending that stuff to my email for a long time and kind of writing all this. And then I got very nervous about that once the war started, especially because I thought, oh, what if this gets discovered? I'm not sure exactly how that plays out. I don't know if I can just leave.
Espionage. Yeah, the government targets you and comes after you.
And I don't know, maybe that was paranoid. But anyways, like, so became no longer functional. Like, I really, really came to hate myself. It wasn't like I didn't just feel like I didn't recognize the person in the mirror. I felt like I despised this person. I lost like 25 pounds because it was difficult to eat at work when the starvation campaign was happening. My hand would just sort of tremble on my way to work. I broke down in the bathroom like several times and just kind of cried over it. I felt very nervous. Like, there was multiple bomb threats at the consulate when I was there. We had to cancel events because of bomb threats. The FBI arrested a guy named Anas Saeed who had pledged allegiance to ISIS and was planning to attack the consulate. There was those embassy workers that got killed, so there was that aspect of it too. So I talked it out with my family and everything. I was just like, I can't do this anymore. I have to leave. So that morning I showed up. I went back and deleted every single email I'd ever sent to myself. I made sure I was logged out of all my accounts to where it wouldn't automatically log into my Gmail or Google Drive or whatever. And then I went and told my boss, and I only lied by omission. Like, I just said, hey, I'm too frightened to do the job. I can't do this anymore. And that was a really emotional whirlwind experience just because they were very sympathetic to that. And I knew I was also kind of lying to them and how I really felt very much different than how I was pretending to feel at work, which, makes you feel slimy and you feel really guilty and everything, and because you are guilty, or I was guilty. And then I remember just walking out of the door for the last time, knowing that was going to be the last time I was ever in there, and just feeling an enormous rush of relief and just thinking, oh, I should have done it so sooner. And like, it wasn't till after I left that I really, really started to process and understand what kind of a toll this had taken on my psyche. And now I'm standing here and I don't want a safe place to heal. I want to enter this like arena of ideas, and people need to know that this is what's happening. And there's this taboo about talking about the religious aspect of the conflict, I think, because it either frightens people or it hurts their feelings, or they think you're being bigoted for calling out bad ideas on any side of this. And people need to take this serious as a warning. It's not just the Israel-Palestinian conflict. International affairs didn't even totally make sense to me until I stopped believing in supernatural forces governing the universe. And when you accept that we live in a world with no gods dictating anything, yeah, it's all about what we do and how we protect each other's rights or don't, or violate them.
What do we do now? Is there a resource where people can learn about what you're doing, or is there something on the broader stage that people should be doing? What do you think?
I would encourage people to at least think critically about this. Like Seth, one of the things I love so much about like you and your show, you said a million times, you are not the thinking atheist. The thinking atheist is a call to think critically about why we would believe what we believe, and is it responsible and is it rational too? And that's what I would encourage people to do. And a lot of times when we talk about this in the atheist discourse world, I think it understandably revolves around separation of church and state in this country. And I'm here to highlight the foreign policy aspect of this, coming from someone who was there on the inside and did it. And also I do have an educational background into it, but I think it's more important to know, hey, this is what it looks like from the inside. If someone wants to read more about what I've written a few articles for the Libertarian Institute. I'm not actually libertarian, but they were interested.
I'm glad you got in front of that. I'm glad you got in front of it. When you say the word libertarian, and all of a sudden people start circling like wolves. So,
I mean, at this point in our politics, all sorts of words, whether it's libertarian, Zionism, left, right, like everything.
You saw an outlet. You saw an outlet where you could go and share the ideas, and it happened to be a libertarian magazine. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah. So, if you just Google my name, I'm sure it'll come up. I think I've written 5 so far that are out there. But yeah, I think it's also, when you vote, find out if your elected officials are being influenced by this kind of theological based thinking, or if they actually are taking a sober assessment of what's in your own U.S. interest when they're making their decisions.
A 400-page manuscript that may one day become a book. Well, I'll keep my radar open for that, my friend. Thanks for giving us a behind-the-scenes look at a very complicated issue and what is ultimately a human rights issue. Thanks again, brother.
Thank you.
All right, this has been a brief, kind of messy, and very imperfect conversation about some very serious events. Thanks for sticking with me this far. I hope you found it compelling. I will see you back here next week. I'm going to be talking to a guy named Scott Latta, who did a 2-year investigation of the American megachurch, and he wrote a book about it. He's going to join me to talk about his journey next week. I'll see you then.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter for a complete archive of podcasts and videos, products like mugs and t-shirts featuring the Thinking Atheist logo, links to atheist pages and resources, and details on upcoming free thought events and conventions. Log on to our website, thethinkingatheist.com.